Welcome to the deep dive. We're really glad you decided to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Because the historical territory we're about to cover is it's an incredible study in military strategy, human endurance, and, well, systemic collapse.
hmm
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore Operation Michael. That was the formidable opening thrust of the 1918 German Spring Offensive during the First World War.
It is a truly remarkable topic to dissect. The sheer scale and the doctrinal shifts that occurred over those couple of weeks in the spring of 1918, they effectively reshaped modern warfare.
Exactly. And to guide us through this, we're relying on a really comprehensive historical article that details the grand strategies, the on-the-ground tactics, and the absolute fog of war that define the operation.
Right.
And the facts we pulled from this source are genuinely surprising. We're looking at the largest single artillery barrage in the history of warfare, the lethal debut of elite German stormtroopers.
And the profound psychological irony of an advancing army losing its momentum because they discovered a hidden stash of enemy chocolate and champagne.
Yes, it sounds like a detail from a novel, right? But that cognitive dissonance had real tactical implications.
Absolutely. I think it's crucial to frame the historical stakes right out of the gate here. This deep dive isn't just about moving pieces on a map. What we are examining is a desperate do-or-die gamble by a nation that is essentially starving.
Right.
Germany is trying to win a global war of attrition before American troops can arrive in full force and definitively tip the scales. It is a literal race against the clock. So as we navigate through these events, I'd love for you to keep one question in mind. What stands out to you when you hear about soldiers being pushed past the absolute limits of human endurance?
Okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp the gravity of Operation Michael, we need to set the stage in early 1918.
Let's do it.
Germany's domestic situation is dire. The civilian population is facing severe food shortages, largely due to the Allied naval blockade. But geopolitically, they just received this unprecedented windfall.
The Russians surrender.
Exactly. Russia negotiates a surrender and signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. With the Eastern Front secured, Germany is suddenly able to transfer nearly 50 divisions of battle-hardened soldiers straight to the Western Front.
It was massive.
For the first time in years, the German forces actually outnumber the Allies in France and Belgium.
And that numeric advantage is precisely why that clock we mentioned is ticking so loudly in the ears of the German High Command. The United States has entered the war, and the American Expeditionary Force is actively building up its logistics and manpower in France. German intelligence is highly aware of the timeline. They expect 318,000 American soldiers to land by May and over 1 million by August. Wow. The window for a German victory is closing fast. They know their only chance is to definitively fracture the Allied lines before that American industrial and demographic weight just bears down on them.
You mentioned they knew the Americans were coming, but looking at the mastermind of this offensive General Erich Ludendorff, did the German High Command genuinely believe they could push the entire British Expeditionary Force into the sea? Or was that just an exercise in logistical hubris?
It was an immense strategic gamble, undoubtedly tinged with hubris. I mean, Ludendorff's plan was essentially a massive, size-like flanking maneuver that armies simply hadn't successfully executed since the trench network solidified years prior.
Right.
He wanted to attack the British lines on the Somme, achieve a clean breakthrough, and then wheel his forces northwest. The objective was to physically sever the British forces from the French, capture the vital channel ports, cut off British supply lines, and force a rapid capitulation.
And Ludendorff knew exactly where to aim that scythe. He targeted a highly vulnerable section of the line held by the British Fifth Army. They were commanded by General Hubert Gough.
A very tough spot to be in.
Because of heavy political pressure from the French, the British had recently been forced to take over a new, extended section of the front line. But this newly inherited line was essentially a mirage.
Yeah, it wasn't much of the line at all.
It was poorly prepared, filled with isolated outposts, and situated in the cratered wasteland left over from the 1916 Somme battles. Furthermore, the British were suffering a severe manpower shortage at the time, which forced them to reorganize and shrink their divisions from 12 battalions down to just 9.
And we really need to pause on that arithmetic. Because shrinking from 12 battalions to 9 isn't just an administrative footnote. It completely breaks the tactical math of their defense.
How so?
Well, the British were trying to implement a strategy called defense in depth. The idea wasn't just to have solid lines of trenches. It was to create a web of mutually supporting machine gun redoubts, essentially fortified islands.
Like a layered net?
Exactly. You got a forward zone, a battle zone, and a rear zone. The goal was to absorb the shock of an attack and bleed it dry. But because Goff lost 25% of his infantry, he simply didn't have the bodies to man those islands.
Right, and the tragic reality on the ground was that they hadn't even had time to finish constructing those zones.
No, not even close.
The forward zone was lightly held, the battle zone had redoubts that were spaced way too far apart to cover each other with crossfire. And that crucial rear zone, because of acute labor shortages and the notoriously difficult chalky soil of the Somme, the rear zone was essentially just chalk outlines on the ground when the attack began.
Yeah.
Goff was begging for labor battalions, but the political leadership in London was withholding reinforcements.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the German assault. Because the Germans weren't just bringing more men to this weak point, they were fundamentally altering their military doctrine.
Right, no more linear advances.
Exactly. Listeners familiar with the era know the linear advance tactics of 1916 were largely obsolete, but the German infiltration tactics of 1918 were still a massive evolutionary leap. They developed elite units called Stoßtruppen, or stormtroopers.
They abandoned the rigid linear advance entirely.
They did.
And the innovation wasn't just in their loadout, though they were heavily armed with light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers. The real innovation was pushing decision-making down to the squad level.
That's the key.
Their orders were to bypass the heavily defended British strongpoints entirely. If you hit a machine gun nest, you don't assault it. You flow around it like water, slip through the gaps, and push deep into the rear to attack headquarters, artillery parks, and supply lines. It was all about severing the enemy's nervous system.
What's fascinating here is how the artillery evolved to synchronize with this new infantry doctrine. For years, armies operated under the assumption that artillery destroys and infantry occupies. You would bombard a trench for 2 weeks, churning the ground into impassable mud and basically telegraphing your attack to the enemy.
Right, giving them plenty of time to bring up reserves.
Exactly. The Germans, guided by artillery genius Georg Bruckmüller, abandoned destruction in favor of neutralization. They utilized what was called a hurricane bombardment,
which was incredibly brief, lasting only a few hours, but mathematically precise and intensely concentrated.
Precisely. And they utilized a very specific, terrifying chemical sequence. They didn't just fire high explosives, they opened with tear gas.
Oh, wow.
The tear gas would penetrate the British gas masks, causing the soldiers to vomit and pull their masks off. Once the masks were off, the artillery switched to lethal phosgene and chlorine gas, mixed with heavy concentrations of mustard gas to contaminate the artillery batteries and command posts.
That is brutal.
The goal was to completely paralyze British communications before the stormtroopers even left their trenches.
The tragic irony is that even if General Goff had miraculously finished those rear defenses, the environmental conditions on the morning of March 21st would have rendered those mutually supporting redoubts nearly useless.
Yeah, the weather was a huge factor.
Imagine you're on the ground that morning. When the storm finally broke, it broke with a fury that is difficult to fathom. Winston Churchill was actually present that morning, inspecting troops near the front.
That's right.
He described the start of the German bombardment with a quote that vividly captures the scale. He said, "Exactly as a pianist runs his hands across the keyboard from treble to bass, there rose in less than 1 minute the most tremendous cannonade I shall ever hear."
Give you chills.
He described it as a continuous curve of leaping red flame. In just 5 hours, the Germans fired over 3.5 million shells across a 150-square-mile area.
And you have to picture the weather. When dawn broke on March 21, a thick, heavy morning fog blanketed the Somme Valley. Visibility was barely 10 yards.
You can't even see the next trench.
Right. When you combine that dense natural fog with the thick smoke and chemical gas from 3.5 million artillery shells, the British defenders were effectively blinded. A machine gun redoubt is useless if the gunners can't see the enemy 50 feet away.
That makes sense.
This was the perfect environment for the German infiltration tactics. The stormtroopers simply slipped right past the forward zone undetected.
Telephone wires were immediately severed by the high explosives, and human runners got hopelessly lost in the fog. British command and control disintegrated within hours. Imagine you were sitting in a brigade headquarters miles behind the line, and the phone lines suddenly go dead.
Terrifying.
You have no idea what is happening until German stormtroopers are suddenly kicking down your door.
In the midst of that fog and systemic collapse, you see incredible, tragic instances of isolated rearguard actions. Because the stormtroopers bypassed the strong points, those British garrisons were left surrounded deep behind enemy lines. On the second day of the battle, March 22, there was a redoubt known as Manchester Hill. The garrison was the 16th Manchesters, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Wilfrid Elstob.
Elstob had told his men beforehand that they would defend the hill to the last, and they did exactly that. Cut off and facing overwhelming numbers, they fought for hours, severely disrupting the German timetable. Elstob himself was killed at 16:30 that afternoon. But their stubborn resistance exemplifies the desperate holding actions taking place across the sector. However, those tactical stands were undermined by massive communication failures at the operational level. For instance, British General Ivor Max, commanding the Th Corps, received orders from General Gauck outlining a fighting retreat if the tactical situation demanded it.
Okay.
But in the utter chaos of the severed communication lines, Max misinterpreted this contingency as a direct order to fall back all the way to the River Somme. This forced his 36th Division to retreat prematurely across the canal, abandoning defensible ground and forcing adjacent units to scramble backward just to cover the resulting gaps. It created an incredibly fluid, exhausting environment for the soldiers. By days 3 and 4, formal units were fragmenting. You have men from different battalions, cooks, and engineers just clumping together to form ad hoc defense lines.
Yeah, total chaos.
There's a remarkable account of Lieutenant Alfred Herring. He was an officer who had never actually been in combat before.
Really?
Yeah. Yet on March 23, he takes command of a small platoon of untested men, leads a counterattack to recapture the vital Montaigne Bridge, and stubbornly holds it against the advancing German army for 12 straight hours.
Incredible.
He was awarded the Victoria Cross for that action. But despite localized heroism, the overarching reality was that the British were falling back miles every single day.
Which, on a map in Ludendorff's headquarters, looked like a spectacular success. But this rapid, unprecedented advance created a severe logistical vulnerability.
They outran their supplies?
Exactly. The German infantry was marching far outpacing their own supply lines. They were physically dragging heavy machine guns and trench mortars over the pulverized, crater-strewn wasteland of the 1916 Somme battlefields. They were physically redlining, reaching the absolute limits of human endurance.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to look at the intersection of propaganda and logistics.
Oh, this is fascinating.
The German High Command had been feeding their troops a very specific narrative. The soldiers were told that the unrestricted U-boat campaign was starving the British Isles, that the Allies were on the brink of collapse, and that one massive push would shatter their fragile military.
Right.
But as these exhausted, starving German stormtroopers push deep into the British rear zone, they start overrunning abandoned British supply dumps.
And what do they find in those dumps? The exact opposite of a starving enemy. They find vast quantities of canned meat, writing paper, fresh boots. They find massive stashes of chocolate and even champagne.
It's just wild to picture.
You really have to analyze the psychological impact of that discovery. Put yourself in the boots of a German stormtrooper. You've been living on meager rations of turnip bread. You know your family back in Germany is suffering through the turnip winter, boiling wallpaper to survive.
Yeah.
You've been assured the enemy is in worse shape. Then you capture their trenches and discover they're eating chocolate and drinking champagne.
The cognitive dissonance must have been staggering.
It was a profound psychological blow. In that single moment of discovery, the troops realize their leadership has been lying to them. The Allies aren't starving. The British Empire's supply chain is robust.
Right.
Combine that sudden, crushing demoralization with the sheer physical exhaustion of a multi-day advance, and the vaunted German momentum noticeably bogs down. Entire companies stop advancing. They sit in the captured trenches, looting the food and wine because they were simply too hungry and too disillusioned to keep marching.
It is a striking historical insight how the mundane discovery of a supply depot can act as a friction point that alters the pacing of a massive offensive. And while the German advance lost its crucial speed to forage for food, the exhausted Allies were finding these miraculous second wins. Look at the British 54th Brigade on March 25. These soldiers have been executing a punishing fighting retreat for 4 days straight. They are heavily attrited.
Just completely worn out.
They finally receive orders to fall back behind a river line to rest. But just as they're marching towards safety, They get a sudden reversal of orders, turn around and execute a counterattack on a village called Babeuf.
By all physiological metrics, that brigade should have collapsed.
Exactly. But instead, they form up, fix bayonets, and charge the village. They achieve total tactical surprise against the Germans, who assumed they were just facing scattered French rearguards.
Wow.
The 54th Brigade wins the engagement, taking 230 prisoners and capturing 10 machine guns and about 20 minutes of close quarters fighting, and their ultimate reward for this localized victory. They finally get to sit in the cornfields, bring up the filled kitchens, and eat a hot meal.
That kind of localized resilience was buying the Allied High Command the one resource they desperately needed: time. By March 26, the political and military leadership of Britain and France realized that this disjointed, uncoordinated retreat was courting disaster. They convened the Doullens Conference.
And from what the sources indicate, the political friction in that room was intense. The French commander, General Pétain, was highly pessimistic, seemingly ready to fall back and simply cover Paris, which would have left the British flank completely exposed.
Yes, the coordination between the Allies up to this point was largely based on gentlemen's agreements rather than a unified chain of command.
Right.
The crisis of Operation Michael forced their hands. At Doullens, they made the monumental decision to finally appoint French General Ferdinand Foch as the supreme Allied commander, or Generalissimo. For the first time in the war, there was formal, structural unity of command.
That's a huge turning point.
Foch had the authority to coordinate the French and British armies together, strategically deploying French reserves to plug the gaps in the British lines that Ludendorff was trying to exploit.
Right around this time, we also see a massive technological shift entering the battlefield. At a gap in the line near Colin camps, the British deploy their new Whippet tanks.
Oh, the Whippets.
Yeah, these weren't the slow, lumbering, heavy tanks that got stuck in the mud back in 1916. The Whippets were lighter, heavily armed with machine guns, and crucially, much faster. It was their very first combat deployment.
Just in time, too.
Just 12 of these Whippet tanks emerged from a village, and the shock value was devastating. Roughly 300 German infantrymen who were exhausted and had no anti-tank weaponry broke and fled in panic. The Whippets capitalized on the exact thing the Germans were losing: mobility. They could exploit the gaps, turning the German infiltration tactics against them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the introduction of Allied reserves and faster armor highlights a fatal strategic flaw on the part of General Ludendorff. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of the operation.
Okay, what is it?
Ludendorff possessed brilliant tactical vision, but lacked a coherent operational strategy. He famously remarked, "We chop a hole, and the rest follows." But that isn't how grand strategy works.
Right.
Instead of ruthlessly concentrating all of his forces on the areas where he had actually broken through the weak British Fifth Army, he kept shifting his attacks to try and widen the breach at its strongest points.
Which led to Operation Mars on March 28.
Precisely. He launched Operation Mars against the British Third Army around Arras to the north. But the Third Army hadn't been severely weakened. They were heavily defended, organized, and anchored on the formidable bastion of Vimy Ridge.
A completely different scenario.
Exactly. Ludendorff threw 29 divisions against them, and they were decisively repulsed. He burned through his exhausted elite troops by throwing them against the strongest parts of the Allied line, simply to reinforce tactical engagements rather than pursuing a strategic objective.
Meanwhile, the political fallout on the Allied side resulted in a tragic injustice for British General Hubert Gough. His Fifth Army had taken the absolute brunt of the initial Storm 80 German divisions crashing into his 15 British divisions.
And most impossible odds.
Despite lacking the manpower, lacking the rear defenses, and facing an unprecedented tactical doctrine, Gough conducted a brilliant, stubborn 38-mile fighting retreat. He kept his army intact, prevented a total rout, and denied the Germans their strategic objectives.
You really did.
And his reward. He was what the military called Stellenbosch, relieved of command and sent home to be the political scapegoat for the fact that the Germans broke the line at all.
It was deeply unfair and heavily driven by the panic in London. Gauff's Fifth Army had absorbed the heaviest blow of the war and essentially fought the German offensive to a standstill.
Yeah.
By early April, Operation Michael was running on fumes. Ludendorff launched one final, desperate thrust toward the vital Allied rail center of Amiens, specifically targeting the town of Villers-Bretonneux on April 4th.
And that's famous for another reason, right?
Yes, this engagement is notable in military history because it featured the first simultaneous use of tanks by both sides in combat. But the German advance was finally, definitively halted by a brilliantly organized night counterattack by Australian and British infantry. The following day, April 5th, recognizing the exhaustion of his forces and the stiffening of the Allied line, Ludendorff officially terminated the offensive.
So, what does this all mean? When the dust finally settled on Operation Michael, the statistics were staggering. The Germans had captured 1,200 square miles of territory and pushed the front line forward by up to 40 miles. That's an unprecedented territorial gain for the Western Front.
Absolutely.
But crucially, they completely failed to achieve their strategic objectives. They didn't capture the vital rail hub of Amiens, they didn't reach the channel ports, and they did not split the British and French armies apart.
And the human cost of that territorial gain was devastating. We're looking at roughly 250,000 German casualties and about 255,000 Allied casualties.
Unbelievable number.
But the strategic impact of those numbers was highly asymmetrical. The Allies were losing men and material, yes, but they had the Americans pouring into French ports by the tens of thousands every week to replace them. Furthermore, Allied industry was churning out thousands of new artillery pieces and tanks.
Well, Germany couldn't replace those losses.
Germany had permanently lost its irreplaceable, highly trained Stoßtruppen. They had burned their best men to capture a strategically useless wasteland of shell craters. Ultimately, the tactical success but strategic failure of Operation Michael marked the beginning of the end of the First World War for Germany.
It is a profound piece of history, a narrative of shifting doctrines, the integration of new technologies, and the sheer endurance of the soldiers forced to execute these grand designs on the ground. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope you walked away with a clearer understanding of the mechanics and the human element behind one of the most pivotal military operations of the 20th century.
I echo that sentiment. And as we conclude, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, returning to that captured supply dump. Consider how the mundane discovery of enemy chocolate, writing paper, and champagne might have done more to shatter the fighting spirit of an elite army than millions of rounds of high explosives. It raises a fascinating question about the true nature of warfare. It makes you wonder how much of a military's immense power relies not on its kinetic weapons or its tactical doctrine, but entirely on the fragile stories the soldiers are told, and what inevitably happens the moment those stories are shattered by reality.